So good morning, everybody. Can everybody hear me?
Here you go.
Okay. So good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us. Welcome to today's discussion panel on change management. How does a successful financial data organization overcome the barriers to change? We have three outstanding experts to join us to address this question today: Linda Powell from Citigroup, Hudson Hollister from H-Data, and John Bottega from the EDM Council. It's my pleasure to moderate today. My name is Greg Felberg. I'm a research scholar and the head of research at the Yale Program on Financial Stability. Our program offers a master's degree in systemic risk, and we have a research program called the New Paget Project that produces case studies and lessons learned about historical financial crises. It's also my pleasure to be part of a group that has been organizing this series of webinars on the theme of financial stability analysis and data, minding the gaps. We need to give a big thanks to Russ Wormers and the Center for Financial Policy at the Smith School at the University of Maryland for hosting and supporting this series. Russ is a leading expert in asset management issues who I have the pleasure to work with at the Office of Financial Research. His center provides a nonpartisan forum where experts from finance, government, and academia can work together and exchange ideas, and I hope today's event will be a good example of that. So this is the second in our series. We kicked off in October with a discussion of data issues with Fed Vice Chair Randy Quarles and Stanford Professor Gerald Duffy. If you haven't seen it, I urge everyone to go back to the University of Maryland website and watch the recording. UMD is also posting research related to this topic on its website. Later sessions of our series will talk in more detail about data gap and data standard issues. Today, we're going to talk about the challenges that financial organizations face in identifying, collecting, standardizing, and sharing the data they need to do their jobs. Let me just offer a couple of minutes of background. So financial data are everywhere. They're essential to everybody. You depend on financial data for your banking, your checking, and your purchasing every day. We also learned in the global financial crisis and again in the March COVID market dash for crash that everybody involved in financial markets needs granular, high-quality data to follow financial markets. Banks need the data, investors need data, regulators need data, and academics need data. Data need to be interoperable and to follow certain standards so they can be compared and aggregated. Data need to be shared, both firms within an individual firm and across regulators. Data need to be shared or nobody can really do anything with it. Outside investors and academics need access to data. It's essential for policymakers to have that kind of analysis. And COVID has again showed us that what we should have learned 12 years ago, that regulators don't have the data they need. So just at a few recent reports, we've been here before. The Financial Stability Board noted last month that the data weren't adequate in March for anybody to get a system-wide perspective on the market turmoil that we were experiencing. The Fed official noted several parts of financial markets that proved insufficiently transparent during the crisis, especially repo and treasuries. And the FSB also noted that there are new data gaps that were revealed right there. So our goals today are to talk about what are the bureaucratic and political barriers to change, the barriers to getting the data we need, to sharing it, and to making sure that it follows standards. And second, how do we overcome those barriers? What are the lessons for firms and regulators? So I couldn't ask for a better panel of speakers to address these issues. They have years of experience working with similar problems of data standardization, sharing, and collection across both private and public organizations. Linda Powell is a global head of data governance at Citibank, formerly the CDO at the CFPB and at the OFR. Hudson Hollister is the CEO of H-Data and the former president and founder of the Data Foundation. And John Bottega is the president of the EDM Council and the former CDO at Bank of America and at the New York Fed. So with that introduction, I guess why don't we start with a kind of a question for everybody, for starters. I've kind of briefly described the problem. Give me an example from your own personal experience where you've tried to fix a data standard. And tell me what's so hard about this. What is it that the financial industry has trouble with data standards? I see Hudson smiling the most, so maybe Hudson can go first.
I'm happy. I'm sorry. Who did you say?
That's it. Go ahead, Linda.
Oh, okay. I'll mention and say thanks, Greg, for having us to talk today. It's actually nice to see everyone's faces in this day and age. So first of all, I'll talk about after the last financial crisis. We did a deep dive, and actually I worked closely with John on this because he was at the New York Fed at the time, and I was at the Board of Governors at the time. And we scrambled a lot during the financial crisis, and we were able to get the data that we needed to take the actions that we had to do with the Fed. Part of that was because we had free sight and we created some cross-referencing databases that allowed us to do analysis quickly. And part of it was because we rolled up our sleeves and worked a lot of hours. What we did following the crisis was we convened a number of forums to talk about what would have helped us during the financial crisis to better deal with it, probably not prevent it, but work through it more efficiently and effectively. And there were a number of things that we found within the financial systems ecosystem that we thought would be helpful. But the main thing that kept popping up, every discussion, we had forums with dozens of regulators, with the Fed and the OCC and the FDIC and the SEC and you know, large numbers of groups about what was missing in the infrastructure of the financial system that we needed to address this better in the future. And the main thing that kept popping up was the need for unique and persistent entity identification. I often talk about my example of City National Bank, that there's, I think, you know, years ago, I don't know if the statistics still hold, but there are 14 banks that are unrelated in the U.S. that all have the name City National Bank, and there's over 100 that have some derivation of that name. So when you're trying to transact a trade or get the financial data from to understand their safety and soundness, you really need a universal, unique, persistent identifier to be able to know that you're working with the correct bank or financial institution. And we found that we didn't have in the financial industry a unique, persistent identifier. There were a few identifiers, but none of them met all of the criteria of being unique and being persistent. And by persistent, I mean, I often use my personal example. I have a Social Security number. I've changed my name. I've lived in different states. But the IRS always finds me because of my Social Security number. That has never changed. It doesn't matter where I live. It doesn't matter what company I work for. It doesn't matter what my name is. They know me by my unique, persistent identifier. We didn't have that for financial institutions. So a group of us, we had, I think it was, correct me if I'm wrong, John, I think we had a group of 16 regulators, financial regulators, developed a coalition or a consortium to figure out how to solve this problem of unique identification. When I started out on it, I looked at it from a U.S. perspective, and John quickly corrected me that we just couldn't be U.S.-centric. We really had to be global because we don't live in a U.S.-centric financial world. So we got our 16 regulators together, and we put together a white paper. And within a pretty short period of time, I think it usually takes about 5 years for a concept to become an ISO standard. John, I don't remember the exact timing, but it was somewhere around a year. that we went from concept to ISO standard for the legal entity identifier. It still has a long ways to go for it to become ubiquitous, but it is definitely, it's on its way. I'm going to let John talk for a little bit about that experience, and maybe we can talk about what were the barriers and why was this particular example successful?
I think, Linda, it sounds like you teed it off to me. I'll cover a couple things real quick and certainly talk about the LAI experience. But, Greg, first of all, I think it's interesting you use the term fix a data standard. I don't think that's an achievable activity to fix a standard. My involvement in this goes back to my days at Lehman, actually, back in the 90s when we were putting up the first security master and custom masters. Then standards for us at the time was related on just consistent definition. So, a data dictionary that defines what a bond is or a stock is or what a customer is and things like that. And in those early days, we were pretty successful within lines of business, but to try to do it organizationally, systemically across the whole company, really, really difficult to do because of conflicting priorities, legacy environments that didn't allow adoption of new things. That was very difficult. Kind of fast forward a little bit from there, I was involved early on in what was called the Global STPA Association, the Straight Through Processing Association. Linda, you may remember that. And that was a big event, right? All industry together to standardize cross-border trading and settlement. I think it was just one of those activities that was so big it kind of collapsed under its own weight, right? They were trying to solve every problem in that space at one shot. The good story, of course, is LEI. And Linda, I think it was around 16 groups got together, agencies. I think we identified like 20 different identifiers across the 16 groups, right? Everybody had their own adopted identifier. And what I found was the biggest challenge was, and this is not just LEI, this is any standard, it's usually not an issue of a technical or business barrier, it's usually a commitment of will. To get an organization to commit to, keep in mind now, even though they're not efficient, these processes are already baked in. Companies are already doing it. They already baked in the cost associated with it. And to get them to change, to adopt to something new is really, pushing that rock up a hill kind of thing. So that's one of the biggest challenges, I think, with adoption of standards. Not whether it's feasible, it's whether we can make that commitment to change processes. Now LEI, I think, and you're right, Linda, I think we had that. I think it was a little bit more than a year, but it was on the ground running in a year. And probably the ISO adoption came within 2 or 3 years, which I always compare that to CUSIP, when CUSIP was established in the 60s, 70s. I think that took like 8 or 9 years. And that wasn't a negative against that. Times are different, but LEI advancing as quickly as it did, I think was very, very impressive. And I think we're going to talk about it, still some challenges with LEI adoption. But just to go back to your original question, Greg, it's pushing against change, and that's always difficult in any organization. And now think of doing change across an entire industry. It's a challenge. You're on mute, Linda.
Okay. So, John, I think you hit the nail on the head when you're talking about it's a matter of change management. It's really hard to go from what I'm doing today to adopt a standard, because what I'm doing today is usually I have complete control over what I'm doing today, and I'm not dependent on anybody else, and I don't have to make any compromises if your standard doesn't exactly fit into how I work through things. I think the challenge is getting people to recognize the efficiencies and the cost savings that can be achieved from standardization. And just, if you think about light bulbs, if we didn't have one standard light bulb size, although I realize there are actually a couple of different, but your average light bulb is really standardized, versus you think about the pain we go through with chargers. Like I can't use anybody else's charger unless they happen to have an Apple phone. The pain we go through with chargers. If we had one standard for all of these items, then everything becomes interchangeable, and it's so much easier to get through what John was talking about with the straight-through processing, because you don't have to adapt everything.
Yep.
So it sounds like the adoption of a standard partly depends on the cost-benefit analysis that each individual organization involved has to make, and certainly there are winners and losers. And I guess the LEI somehow was able to win in that equation, and maybe other standards are harder.
That other standards are harder to do. I think you're going to find that the challenge exists no matter what standard is being proposed. I mean, we're talking about now standards around content definition. I mean, here we are in an industry that our entire industry is based on the movement of product, right? Financial instrument, bonds, stock, etc. Most industries that transact business with products have standardized their products. In finance, we still have a tendency not to do that.
And I think that highlights an important truth. Greg, I would disagree that agencies are doing a cost-benefit analysis for the adoption of standards. I think in many instances, financial regulators and other kinds of regulators don't even get to that point. They do not see the benefit. The leadership of these agencies do not see the benefit or the need for standards to begin with, because they are subject matter experts in whatever the subject matter of that agency is. At the SEC, where I used to work, securities lawyers are the ones that lead the agency, and data and technology and standards are not part of their careers up to that point.
So we can move on to the next topic. I was going to ask Linda and John, as you both had roles as chief data officers in the past, in similar roles in government agencies and in big banks. Tell me how that role has evolved over the last 10 years, and how the questions that you're asked to address may have changed.
Linda, I'll take a shot at that first, if you don't mind. So, Greg, I had the opportunity of being one of the first CEOs back in 2006, and I can tell you from my own experience, literally every meeting I went into, I had to explain to somebody what I was. You know, what is the CDO? Well, I'm doing this, and the role was somewhat amorphic. And you know, well, what are you different than technology? What are you focusing on? And so in the early stages, it was an evolving definition of that responsibility. One of the problems was that the scope of the responsibility was limited. We didn't have authority back then. And really, frankly, it wasn't fully understood the role we played in relationship to technology. And I used to define it as my role is to focus on content. Technology's focus is on the movement of content, right? Just a way to distinguish those two. The good news is we're now 15 years later, dramatically different. Greg, it's the EDM Council did a survey at the end of last year. Really interesting metrics came out. The role of the CDO, first of all, their responsibility has expanded to include not only basic data management, governance, policy, things like that, but the CDOs have matured. They're now a more significant role in the C-suite. They've taken on accountability for analytic strategies in many firms. They have taken on accountability for data ethics and the use of data in things like AI and machine learning. You're seeing now CDOs are accountable for things like ESG data and the capture and the reporting and the disclosure of ESG data. So the scope of the CDO has dramatically changed. Their reporting lines have changed. Early on, it was reporting into technology. We've seen a big shift now where now CDOs are reporting to COOs. For the first time, we've seen this in our survey. I think it was 15 or 20% of the CDOs said they are now reporting directly to the CEO. So much like the CIO of 30 years ago that started slowly, lots of turnover, and now you can argue the CIO is one of the most significant members of the C-suite. I think we're seeing that maturity with the CDOs as well. Linda, is that your observation?
Yeah, so I can chime in and say that I had a similar experience, Tom, where 10, 15 years ago, nobody understood what is a chief data officer. When I took my first chief data officer role, people were like, well, what does that mean? I tend to like to use analogies in life, as any of you who know me will agree with. So I started explaining the chief data office as the chief data office is to data as the head of human resources is to personnel. So the head of human resources doesn't manage every person in an organization, and the chief data officer isn't personally managing every data set in an organization, but in both cases, we're setting up the guidance and the guidelines and ensuring that things are done in the way that they're supposed to be done. So that seemed to help people a good bit and just sort of wrap their head around what should the role of a chief data officer be. I've also, over the last several years, watched the role evolve, and I have to say that it has increased in importance over the years. And I think part of that is the recognition that data is important to a big part of this. And I think the other part of that is just the explosion in the volume of data that we've seen over the last 10 to 20 years. When I was at the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, we went from managing our data, talking about it in gigabytes, to talk about it, managing our data in terabytes. And for those of you who are not familiar with the terabyte term, the term 1 terabyte of data is equivalent to the print copy of the Library of Congress. So it's a lot of data. And so we went from talking about data in much smaller terms to talking about like, oh my God, I'm daily getting a copy of the Library of Congress's print version. So I think a megabyte, I forget the exact analogies, but I think a megabyte is more like a Ford F-150 truck worth of data versus the Library of Congress worth of data. So the volume of data has gone up, and people are always talking about like, oh, what do you have to do to manage big data? And the answer is you need to do the exact same things to manage big data that you need to do to manage small data. It just becomes more and more important. It's like if you've got, a 30 books on your bookshelf, it's easy to find that book, even if they're not organized. If you've got the Library of Congress, if your books are not well organized, it could take you a week to find that book. So it's a matter of keeping it organized. And so I think that has been part of what has driven the need for the Chief Data Office to really move up in importance in an organizational structure. So I'll say 10 years ago, most chief data offices were sort of buried down in the IT functions. Everybody thought of it as part of the IT function. I can say that I am not the chief data officer at Citibank, but my boss is, and I'm 3 down from the CEO. That's pretty high up in the organization, the C-suite, that the chief data officer is 2 down from the CEO. That's getting a lot of weight and a lot of visibility. And I think it's pretty comparable across a lot of the large banks these days.
So Linda, we have a question from the audience, from Francis Gross, and he asks, do agencies even pay attention to the technical and digital underpinnings of their work? Do the policy people listen to the data people?
So I think Francis could answer that better than any of us.
Unfortunately, we haven't given him a mic, though.
Well, if I can take a shot.
John, you want to take that one?
Yeah. I think, and this is not a negative event against anybody, really. Policymakers are looking at policy, right? They're driving what would become the laws or the guidelines and so forth. and may not, in writing the policy, consider the data ramifications of a particular policy. Many do. Again, I'm not being negative here. But to Francis's question, it's important that as more and more policy writers become data literate and data aware, that they incorporate those considerations in the policies that are written. And I think we've seen a shift in that over the years where a lot of the new directives now take into consideration, I mean, BCBS 239, I know we're going to talk about it in a bit, was policymakers going, hey, you got to get your data right, in order to do risk, in order to do your operations. So like everybody else, we're a lot more educated now in the impacts of information than, say, we were, 5, 10, 15 years ago. I think tide rises all boats, and everybody's becoming better at what they need to do.
Yeah. So I'm going to chime into that and say that I think it is in part the responsibility of the data community to educate the policy world. The policymakers can't know everything about everything. So when there's a medical question, very thematic for the state of the world today, they go to their medical experts. If there's a data question, they need to have a body of knowledge to go through to for data questions. And frankly, just like doctors need to not talk just in medical speak when they're talking to policymakers, we data people need to talk in business terms to policymakers so that they can understand it. I have a little bit of a funny story that there was one position that I started in my previous life in the regulatory community, where the first time I met with the director of the agency, I almost put him to sleep. And at the end of the conversation, he said, well, I really only got about half of what you said. And I took away from that, like, wow, I really need to change my sales pitch. And so what I did after that was I put together, frankly, a data strategy that discussed things in business terms, sent it to him, and got back feedback like, wow, now I get it. And, he said to my partners, give her whatever she needs. Because I had put it in terms that the business people could understand. So I think it's partially on us to be able to communicate and say why it's important for policy to be able to understand it and incorporate the data best practices and principles.
Okay. Can I make a small turn and say, since both you and John, Linda, have had similar roles in both the public and the private sector, how do you compare the challenges of making change happen?
Greg, having lived on both sides, I'd say at a high level, no difference. And what I mean is we have a responsibility to identify the information, make sure it's consistent, it's transparent. Whether I'm reporting to my management in the private sector, I might be reporting information that goes out to the public. When I was with the Federal Reserve, our role there, although the business case was different. Remember, the Fed is ingesting data from, the regulators ingest data from multiple sources and have to make sense of it. But the challenges are the same, right? The data consistency, common definition of information, common data models. So in general, I would say in some cases, the task was even more difficult for the data professional and the regulatory community because you're under incredible pressure in terms of timing. You're taking information. I mean, let's look at the financial crisis, right? We want to be in a position where we can respond quickly to a contagion. And as an industry, we didn't do that too well, both sides, public and private. So I would say that in general, the objective is the same, although, the use cases might be different.
Yeah, so I have to say, I spent more years working in the government than I like to admit, because I don't like to date myself. And I get asked all the time. What's the difference between working in the public sector and working in the private sector? And honestly, there's really not any difference between working in the public sector and working in the private sector than there was between working for different government agencies or working for different corporate entities. Yeah, nobody thinks that working for Google and working for IBM would be like working in the same organization just because they're both in the private sector. It really is about the culture of the organization more than how you're funded. I would say the one, and what you need to do in terms of data management is really the same. There's a lot of blocking and tackling. You need to have catalogs. You need to have good metadata. You need to have good controls over your data. You need KPIs and metrics. And so whether it's regulatory data or corporate sector data, the rules apply. The biggest difference that I've seen between the public sector and the private sector is really what is driving the motivation of the individuals. And I will say in the public sector, there's a lot of individuals who are just really passionate about whatever agency it is that they're working for. They're really passionate about that mission. Whereas working for a corporate sector, there's much more of I wouldn't say it's a passion for the mission, but it's more of like a family loyalty to the organization. Like we have to do what's best for our corporate organization and clients and shareholders. And it looked like you wanted to chime in there.
I did, but I think that may be the next question that Greg is going to ask us.
Oh, okay.
I'm not sure, Hudson. Go ahead.
Well, when you talk about the need for the data community to educate the policymakers, I think that's exactly right. That's what I've been working to do for the past 7 years or so. For a while, I was the only lobbyist actually going to Capitol Hill and lobbying Congress, registered lobbyist, lobbying Congress in favor of forcing financial agencies to adopt data standards and consistent data practices for all of the information that they collect from their regulated industries. And for a while, in some measure, that worked. Our organization, the Data Coalition, which I started, and I'm not the CEO of it anymore, we've got some fantastic leadership over there now. The Data Coalition was successful in persuading Congress to pass mandates forcing data standards in federal finance, but not in financial regulation. That is still pending. The Data Coalition, I'm on the board still, is still working on that. I'd also point out the Data Coalition was successful in passing the Open Government Data Act. President Trump signed it into law. It was passed almost unanimously at the beginning of 2019. And the Open Government Data Act requires all government agencies, including the financial regulators, to appoint chief data officers, to set up data inventories, and to adopt standards. The mandate is there. The mandate is in place. And I think the elevation of the chief data officer to a statutory role, that mirrors the trend that Linda was discussing in the private sector. The elevation of the chief data officer to a statutory role means that the political and policy leadership of even financial regulatory agencies will be paying more attention to CDOs in the future.
Thanks, Hudson. Say a little bit more about the financial regulators. To what extent have they taken advantage of what's in the Act, even if it's not as mandatory for them? What more could they be doing? And is more legislation needed, or can they make this progress on their own?
It's equally as mandatory for them. There's a companion piece to the Open Government Data Act, the Evidence-Based Policymaking Act, which is not doesn't apply to all agencies the same. But the data portion of that law, the Open Government Data Act, is equally as mandatory on the independent agencies, including most of our financial regulators, as it is for all other agencies. We have seen financial regulatory agencies responding? For example, the SEC appointed a chief data officer. I know there was some discussion inside the SEC about whether they had to follow the law or not. And those that pointed out the law is mandatory won that argument internally. And so the SEC did appoint a chief data officer, and they gave that chief data officer significant authorities inside the agency. And we're seeing that at the others too. They are paying attention. I'm very optimistic about how that's going to go.
Hudson, there is the two sides of there's two sides to that coin, correct? There's and I think, first of all, the Open Government Data Act was fantastic because now it brings attention to the discipline of data management within regulatory agencies. The other side of that is now incumbent upon the government agencies, the regulatory agencies, to adopt industry standards, right, and to bring them into the fray. And that's the next part of that, which is still being discussed. So adopting LAI, adopting these other standards into the operation, which starts to break consistency across all sectors.
Yes, I want to answer Greg's second question, which was, do we need more legislation? If we have good leadership that understands the need for data standardization at the agencies, then the answer is no. All the things that we all, I think the 88 people on this call all agree. We need to have standards in place. We need public sector standards and industry standards. They need to be mandatory. We agree. There's nobody on this call on this presentation who would disagree about that. And I think that there's probably not disagreement among the leadership of the agencies either. It's more indifference than disagreement. If we had better buy-in from the leadership of agencies, then we wouldn't need any more laws. Greg, as you pointed out in the paper that you published this past fall, the Office of Financial Research within the Treasury has the authority to do all the things that need to be done here. Linda is a veteran of that office. John has worked closely with that office. We have the tools that we need, the policy tools. The place where further legislation could help is to show how serious Congress is about holding the regulators to account to fix the gaps in data standardization and data sharing. So legislation, if we do not see leadership from the financial regulators, which right now we do not, perhaps we will see it in the new administration that's coming in, then if we do not see that leadership, then the law is going to be a good thing. And so as a board member of the Data Coalition, I'm still pushing for that law.
So I can chime in for a second and just pick up on Hudson's theme of leadership. And so John and I talked about the legal entity identifier. And I think, frankly, one of the main reasons that the legal entity identifier was we had really strong leadership on it. And it wasn't our day job. It was our passion. And John and Francis Gross, who asked us a question earlier, and many others, all took that as our passion job to move that forward and show leadership throughout the financial regulatory community internationally. We also had the OFR that Hudson just mentioned, took a leadership role as an agency in it. One of the other examples of leadership that I've seen within the U.S. government is we used to have a chief data scientist, he created a data cabinet, and I was very fortunate that I was on that data cabinet with under DJ Patel, who is just an outstanding data scientist. But DJ showed great leadership within not just the financial regulatory community, but the entire government community of data management. And we were looking at what were the barriers that we had for hiring. What were some of the standards that we should be using? Some of the things that are in the rules that Hudson is talking about were things that we were talking about internally within the government to actually push and improve things. We talked about every government agency should have an inventory and catalog of the data that they have. Every government agency I worked for either had that or got it within 6 months or a year after I joined it. But there's some critical foundational things, and I think having DJ Patel as our chief data scientist leading the government community in data practices and data analytics. I mean, he just did amazing work on a couple of different categories of study that I think that kind of leadership is critically important from within the government too.
Linda, I think you're alluding to not only data standards, but also process standards, best practice standards, right? We have to get better at data management. So things like you just pointed out, what are the key things in managing the asset call information? You have to be able to discover it. You have to be able to access it under a controlled environment. And you have to be able to have consistent definitions of that data. Those simple three disciplines weren't really ubiquitously followed, right? Everybody was inventing stuff on their own. It's funny you mentioned the catalog, and I know you'll appreciate this. When I was at the Fed, I answered to the quants and the economists, and that's a tough group of people to service, right? They were hungry for data. My biggest win there was just putting that catalog in front of them so they could find the stuff. Right? Yeah. So those disciplines of data management have to go hand in hand with the content. And that's what I think part of the Open Government Act was. That chief data officer in those government agencies now are not there just for data standards, but also best practice. How to make the data culture happen within an organization.
So you just stumbled on a question I was going to ask, which was, what do we mean by a data-driven culture? And we heard the term a lot, but what does that mean to each of you? I guess we could start with Hudson, maybe.
Data-driven culture. Well, you can't legislate it. That's why I was actually, when the idea of the Open Government Data Act first came up, I was a little skeptical. Are we going to try to put this in a statute? And actually, I think I have a whole slide about the requirements of the Open Government Data Act, but I think I'm not going to show it because the point is not what the specific requirements are. The point is that having the law shows that there's interest from Congress, and that's kind of the soft power of a law as opposed to the hard power of a law. A data-driven culture happens when the leadership are asking the chief data officer to advise them about new rules. And to some extent, that's actually happening. I've heard a lot about that from inside some of our financial regulators. We do have commissioners of the CFTC and commissioners of the SEC going down into the staff of the organization and asking the chief data officer or asking those that are in charge of data analytics what kinds of data structure they would need in new disclosure rules. We've seen that in a good dozen or so prominent new disclosure rules over the past 5 years that I could name. It comes down from the top. Another aspect of a data-driven culture is excitement among the rank and file staff about what they can do once we have interoperable data, granular data, freely shared data. I can give you one fast example. I've been in touch with there's a task force at the SEC that works on pump and dump schemes. The small public companies that end up being fraudulent. They put a shell on and they sell their stock and they end up not having a business at all. Well, that task force inside the SEC is using structured and standardized data in order to apply risk models that help them, from among all the thousands of these tiny companies, help them pinpoint the ones and pinpoint the networks that might actually be indicators of fraud. I hear that a lot. I hear that a lot more now than I did 2 years ago.
John and Linda, before you answer that, I was going to pivot a little bit to BCBS 239, the Basel Committee Data Aggregation and Management Guidance, which I think was very important a few years ago for banking organizations. The Financial Stability Board, which of course is an organization of global central banks, recently said that in their view, none of the global systemically important banks are in compliance with BCBS 239. I guess the question is, what's gone wrong? What good progress has the banking industry made? What are they lacking, and what's getting in the way?
Well, Greg, I'll take a shot at that. I don't want to say that what was stated is incorrect, but I think to just say that the banks haven't or are not in compliance is missing a lot of the story there, right? Because banks have made tremendous progress. First of all, BCBS 239, go back to Hudson, your question about legislators thinking about data. That was legislators thinking about data. Right? And it moved the market. It had a significant impact. Now, BCBS 239 is not legislation. it's a directive, and then it was up to the jurisdictional regulators to, embrace that and put forward laws. Now,
so compliance is too strong a word. I shouldn't have used the word compliance.
well, no, I think it's the word that's commonly used. But what I'm saying is that if you look at the landscape of data management in financial institutions from 10 years ago or 15 years ago when the crisis hit to now, dramatically improved. I mean, if you want evidence, think about the COVID experience, much different now than it was back then. We still have economic struggles, but you're not seeing firms knee-jerk and fire everybody. You're not seeing that. They're trying to embrace this concept of what is this information telling us? How do we use it to manage through this crisis? Very different than it was 15 years ago. So I would say in general, the banks have upped the game, have improved how they manage the asset. Still more to do. And, the only negative, if you want to say, about BCS 239 was assuming it would all be done in 3 years. 20, 30 years of bad behavior, so to speak, is not going to get fixed in 3 years. But I think we're on the right track to become better stewards of that information. And to Hudson's comment about data culture, absolutely, Hudson, top down, it's got to come from, and I don't mean my manager, I mean the CEO of the firm, right? It's got to start there.
Both directions, top down and side to side.
And bottom up, there's got to be an incentive for the person at the brick and mortar, at the operations desk, knowing that what they're doing matters. Too often we say, well, I don't have to worry about this because it's going to be way downstream. Someone's going to care about it. That doesn't work anymore, right? Everybody's got to be involved in that activity. And like I said, data literacy, right? And by the way, one last thing, and I'll defer to Linda. Data management is not a project. It doesn't start and stop. It's got to be part of the culture. Of just like you manage any asset, you have to manage the data asset. I'll stop there and hand over my time to Linda.
Sure. So I guess at the highest level, BCBS 239, is like mom and apple pie of data management. There's several principles that you're supposed to follow, and you read all of them, and like your data should be accurate, your data should be timely, your data should be comprehensive. That's the mom and apple pie and core foundations of data management. So to say that we're not compliant is I think a more technical term. It's like how can you evidence compliance throughout different reporting functions. So I think that's a much harder question to answer, and I think it's a matter of time and evolution. I think John, I don't disagree with John. But I'm going to pivot and go back to what Hudson was talking about, and how do you be data-driven? And I think it's a concept that is not new. And I was just trying to Google and remember the name of the book that I read years and years and years ago. God, I think I was still in college. That really was probably my introduction into the importance of data management before data management was even a concept. And I'm going to ask you guys to help me. I couldn't remember the name of the gentleman, but he was the gentleman who invented the Ford Mustang and ran.
Lee Iacocca.
Lee Iacocca, thank you. Yes, I read the Lee Iacocca biography a million years ago. And the thing that really struck me and probably had some impact on the trajectory of my career that really intrigued me in terms of data was his discussion about how when he went from Ford to John, was it
Chrysler? Chrysler. Yeah, he went
Chrysler,
from
that's it. When he went from Ford to Chrysler, his first problem was he couldn't get accurate financial data about the company. And I remember that just sort of blowing my mind reading this about how do you not have good financial reporting about your own company, and that was the first thing he fixed in order to be able to fix the rest of Chrysler. And so to be data-driven is to be able to have good information about your own organization or about products or about the markets that you're trying to work in so that you can make good business decisions. If you don't have data about the markets that you're trying to operate in, you can't make good business decisions. If you don't know what your own balance sheet should be saying, as Lee Iacocca said in his autobiography, then you don't know what financial decisions you should be making. So to me, being data-driven is foundational to running an organization, that you have to have your facts in place, and you have to have access to your facts, and you have to have access to your facts when you need them. So at the CFPB, we had the data mission, I think was something along the lines of our mission in the Chief Data Office was to have the data that you need when you need it.
Linda,
so that's being data-driven to me.
Since you mentioned Lee Iacocca, I have to tell this quick story, which is evidence of data giving us information. One of the things that he did when he came in was he looked at the cost of transportation of the product, the car. And the car would sit on rail cars and be sent all across the country. What he discovered was because of the length of the Chrysler automobile, they could only put 2 cars on a rail car. The reason for the K car and the length of the K car was so he could put 3 cars on a rail car. He cut his transportation costs down by 30% by shrinking the car. That's taking data and using it to advance the activity. It's a quick side note story, but since you mentioned Lee Iacocca, I have to share that one.
Well, we managed to go 50 minutes today without getting
decision.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, go ahead, Greg.
No, that's okay. So it's been 50 minutes. It's time to talk about fintech a little, I think. So we hear a lot about soup tech and RegTech. I guess the question, maybe Linda could start. How have those things changed the role of a CDO, and how can those tools help you?
So I think there's a lot of potential for these tools. I'm not sure that they've been adopted yet, but I think the main thing with the RegTech that I've seen and is that it forces standardization. And Hudson can probably talk about this more than me because he's more versed in the RegTech world than me. But from what I've seen, and actually there's the FCA in the UK has been doing some amazing partnerships with industry in terms of RegTech. And I will be honest, I haven't followed it very much for the last couple of years. My attention's been diverted, but I was following the FCA really closely for a number of years. They're doing some very cool things, partnering and helping to evolve RegTech so that banks and other financial institutions can institute things that help both the bank and the regulators.
Hudson, you want to take a shot?
I sure do, and I want to see if the team can give me the ability to share my screen the way we discussed, because I've got a fast diagram that I'm going to share with everybody to try to break it down. So if that's possible, I would like to be made the presenter. And until then, I don't see the confirmation of that yet. But what I'll say about RegTech is that all of the different activities of regulation can be made more efficient using technology. Think about what happens in regulation. You've got the regulatory agencies issuing rules and mandates. You've got the regulated enterprises complying with those rules and following the mandates. And then usually the enterprises, whether they're banks or financial firms or energy firms or whatever, they have to report something back to the government, to the regulators. The regulators then analyze that stuff. Sometimes they manually read it. Sometimes they use analytics, let's hope. And then they confirm compliance, and then they usually publish something. Think of the SEC's Edgar system, or think about the other platforms the banking regulators use. They publish something out to the markets, and then investors, helped by tools like Refinitiv and Bloomberg, the investors digest it. Those steps are pretty consistent, whether you're talking about banking regulation, energy regulation, or even healthcare. All of them are being aided by technology right now. But what we have with the promise of standards is we could get straight-through processing all the way from the initial rule and taxonomy being issued, all the way down from the regulators to the enterprises, back up to the regulators and out to the markets. That's what my company works on now. I won't tell you anything about our platforms now, but we think that the adoption of standards allows straight-through processing, and platforms that mediate the information exchange between the regulator and the regulated and investors. We are going to eradicate copy-pasting. We're going to eradicate complex ETL from the world of regulation, and we're going to do it using RegTech platforms, and we're going to be aided in doing that by standards. I'm so excited about that. I think there's a $100 billion market that right now is being captured by lawyers and accountants that will shrink to a $50 billion market being captured just by technology companies to the great benefit of everybody for transparency and efficiency and less rent-seeking in all of the different industries that regulation serves. That's what RegTech means to me, and that's what the adoption of standards is going to get us.
And Hudson, if I can complement that with, you covered the technology. Again, I'm going to go back to business process. We're seeing more and more that the regulatory community in their assessment of firms' data programs are looking at both sides of the coin again, not only their technology infrastructure, but their business practice, their data practice. Think about it again, 10, 15 years ago, everybody was learning. Now you'll see in a regulatory review, they will ask questions about who owns the data. Is it properly governed? Is there adequate procedures in place to validate the quality of the data? So those best practices will also become part of the regulator's playbook, if you will, when they analyze the institutions they're responsible for, and I think that's also making a huge difference. And we've been very fortunate in the work that we do at the EM Council, working with different agencies to, again, help promote best practices, and I think it's infiltrating through all sectors.
Great. So we've only got a couple minutes left, and I guess I was going to get to my magic wand question. If each of you had a magic wand, what one thing would you fix in financial data? I think Hudson might have just gave us his magic wand, but you can answer the question however you like.
Well, I'll give it in a couple of words. Data needs to be aligned to meaning, so consistency of data, provide transparency, and adopt the culture and the literacy of managing that asset.
I would cut to the chase and just say mandatory LEI. There should be no data that doesn't use the LEI. There should be no identification code that is not the LEI. Let's come off the CIK and let's forget about the EIN. We're going to make the LEI mandatory. Everyone's going to be forced to use it. Everyone's going to be forced to get one. That is part of my policy mission. Blunt.
You've got my vote.
Well, I think I'll be a little more generic and just that we would have ubiquitous data standards.
Oh, I think you tried in there. I think I just tried to put something on you there.
What was that?
I think I just it proposed that you get regulated. My bad.
Oh, no. No, we have adopted the LEI at the city. We have LEIs for all of our legal entities. I think it's just ubiquitous data standards and unique data standards. There are some areas where we have 20 data standards for the same thing. So if I could wave my magic wand, there would be one data standard for each problem, and we would all follow that data standard.
I think that was a fantastic way to wrap up. Thank you very much, guys. It was terrific having all of you. I wish we could have just had a Q&A individually with each of you because each of you has so much to say about these topics. And maybe we can do this again sometime. Thank you to Marilyn for hosting.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Greg. It was nice to see you guys.
Happy holidays, everybody.
Bye.
Cheers. Bye.